that he was murdered unjustly. I don't even feel like it's a black and white thing, honestly. You know, in my opinion, I really don't feel like it's a black and white thing. I feel like it's just something that he continued to do, and the police knew. You know, they knew. It wasn't like it was a shock. They knew.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you aboard. I hope you had a great weekend. That was the widow of Eric Gardner, who was killed in that so-called chokehold police takedown, and the grand jury returning no indictment last week. The widow saying in front of Al Sharpton that she doesn't think race was involved. Well, boy, oh boy, that puts a damper on Obama's theory and Holder's theory and Sharpton's theory and the media's theory. No race involved, says the widow of the man who was killed. That's number one. She also talks about how the police knew him, and he knew that they knew he was selling the cigarettes. And so, you know, in other words, he's been arrested 30 times already. She goes on to say they called him, hey, Siggy, or whatever, because that's what he did. She also went on to say he was overweight, had asthma, couldn't get a job because of his asthma and his overweight condition, and that he was lazy. Now, lazy has nothing to do with it, but she said he didn't want to work. So he sold these cigarettes. My point is, she said the cops knew. As a matter of fact, I really don't feel like it's a black and white issue. I feel like it's something that he continued to do, meaning sell those cigarettes. And the police knew. You know they knew. It wasn't like a shock. So the police knew he sold the cigarettes, and he knew the police knew he sold the cigarettes. He was arrested 30 times. And she says it wasn't race. She also says he was murdered. But, you know, and this is not the same as Ferguson. It is not the same as Ferguson by a long shot. But until we have, and we may never have, the grand jury testimony of the 60 witnesses, or the 50 witnesses, 60 exhibits, 50 witnesses, medical examiner's report, other doctors, his condition, his medical conditions, how it might have contributed to the death, we just don't know. And we really have no legitimate right. I mean, we have a right to say what we think, but it doesn't mean anything until we've seen the evidence. And that's number one. Number two, I want you to listen to Melissa Harris Perry on MSNBC talking about rioting, looting, and burning. Watch.
That night, some in Ferguson committed acts of arson, vandalism, and theft. And by the next day, 12 commercial buildings in the city had been destroyed by fire. And let me also just point out that arson and looting, while illegal and not things that I support, and I think also counterproductive in many ways, are also not necessarily violent in that they are violence against property. And that does actually carry a legal difference, right? I mean, violence against property ought to be different than violence against bodies.
Right. I mean, certainly harming a human being is worse than burning down a building.
Right. It should be, right? It is.
It's not necessarily violence. Of course it's different. Of course penalties are different for violence against a person and violence against property. Of course they're different. You rape someone, you murder someone, you physically assault someone. It's different than if you set a fire and burn down a building and no one's injured. Of course, that's what are you, inventing something new? That's the way it is. But to say that arson and looting are not necessarily violence, I mean, you have to be out of your mind and very irresponsible, either by accident or purposely irresponsible. Now, is this because it was blacks who were doing this for the most part? All that I could see, they look black. Is that why she's saying it's not violence? Now, here's a woman who's had to apologize on the air at least once that I could think of, and probably should have apologized many more times. She's somebody who said that, you know, you don't own your children. Parents don't own their children. You know, the community does. I'm paraphrasing. She also called a fetus this little thing, this thing. But this, rioting and looting, or not rioting and looting, let's be arson and looting. Not necessarily violence. Nah, It's justified. See, this is the culture war we are in. As long as there's MSNBC allowing talk like this, and as long as there's Van Jones and Mark Lamont Hale, who in my opinion are professional cop haters, and as long as they're brought on as experts to give their opinion on how the cops handled the situation, we are in a culture war. We are in a war for our very survival as a nation because they're purposely trying to tear it apart. We're coming back with Joe Concha from Mediaite. Don't go away.